Everyone imagines the end of the inner journey as a kind of rising, floating above the mess of being human, finally free of the wanting and the aching and the noise. A serene face on a mountaintop somewhere, far above the ordinary. That's the picture we've all inherited about what it means to become whole. But when Carl Jung spent years buried in the strange, half-forgotten manuscripts of medieval alchemists, he found a map pointing in the exact opposite direction. The completion they described wasn't a floating up and away, it was a coming back down. Back into the body, back into the ordinary day, back into the life you thought the whole journey was supposed to rescue you from. Except now, something has changed in you so completely that the same life feels like a different world. The alchemist had a name for this final stage. They called it the Rubedo, the reddening. And Jung became convinced that these men, hunched over their furnaces trying to turn lead into gold, had accidentally drawn the most accurate picture of psychological wholeness anyone has ever made. They weren't really working with metals. They were watching their own souls transform in the flask and mistaking it for chemistry. Jung looked at their bizarre symbols, the black crow, the white dove, the red king rising from the ashes, and he recognized his patience in them. He recognized himself. He saw that the whole alchemical sequence was a coded description of what a human psyche goes through when it stops running from itself and finally becomes whole. And the Rubedo, the red stage, the gold at the end, was the part almost nobody talks about, because it's the part almost nobody reaches. Today I want to walk you through what Jung discovered about this final reddening, why the earlier stages of dissolution and purification are only the beginning, what actually happens to a person when the color comes back into their life, and why the last stage of becoming yourself isn't a departure from the world, it's the most complete arrival into it you'll ever experience. To understand the reddening, you have to understand what came before it, because the alchemists were describing a sequence, and each phase depended on the one before. They didn't invent this order to be poetic, they observed it, over and over, in the flask and in themselves. The first stage was the nigredo, the blackening. This is the dissolution, the falling apart, the period where everything you built yourself out of turns to ash. If you've ever lived through a stretch of your life where your identity collapsed, where the roles you played stopped fitting, where you felt like you were rotting from the inside and couldn't explain it to anyone, that's the nigredo. The alchemists knew you couldn't make anything new until the old material broke down completely. Winter before spring. Then came the albedo, the whitening. After the blackness, a kind of washing, a purification. The person who survives the dissolution starts to feel clarity returning, a coolness, a distance from the chaos. Insight arrives. You begin to see your patterns from above, like weather. This stage feels like relief after the darkness, and for many people it feels like the destination itself. The mind goes quiet. The turbulence settles into a silver stillness. And here is where Jung noticed something crucial, something that changes how you understand the entire path. Most people who do serious inner work stop at the albedo and think they've finished. They reach the cool white light, the detachment, the peace of finally seeing clearly, and they mistake it for the end of the road. You've probably met someone caught in this place, or been there yourself. The person who has done years of shadow work and now floats slightly above their own life. Calm, insightful, a little remote. They speak beautifully about patterns and projections. They've achieved a genuine serenity. But there's a paleness to them, a bloodlessness, as though in cleaning themselves of the chaos, they also washed out the heat, the mess, the appetite, the very things that make a life feel lived. They've gone white and stayed there. Jung saw this as a real danger, not a small one. The whitening can become a sophisticated hiding place. You can use clarity to avoid feeling. You can use spiritual insight to stay one safe step removed from your own desire, your own anger, your own hunger to actually want things and lose things and be moved by them. The silver light is genuinely peaceful. It's also, if you stop there, only half a person. The alchemists were adamant that the white stage was not the goal. It was a way station. Something more had to happen. The washed and purified material had to be heated again, hotter this time, until it turned from white to gold, from silver to red. And this final firing, this reddening, was the rubedo, the stage where the soul that had died and been purified came back to life in full color. Red, to the alchemists, was the color of blood, the color of the body, the color of passion and warmth and living flesh. When Jung translated their images into psychology, he understood exactly why the final stage wore that color. Because the last movement of becoming whole isn't about rising higher into purity. It's about descending back into your own humanity. But this time, carrying everything you learned in the dark and the light down into the ordinary business of being alive. Think of it like blood returning to a face that had gone pale. Someone comes in from a brutal cold, their skin drained white, half numb, and slowly, painfully, the warmth comes back, the sting of circulation, the flush rising in the cheeks, the color returning to something that had gone bloodless. That flush hurts a little, but it's the feeling of life reoccupying a body it had nearly left. The rubedo is that flush, spread across an entire existence. What does this actually look like in a person? Jung watched it happen slowly, over years, in the people who didn't stop at the cool white clarity but let themselves be heated back into the world. And what emerged surprised nearly everyone because it looked so ordinary. The person who reaches the reddening doesn't become a guru radiating otherworldly calm. They become intensely, unmistakably human. They can be angry when anger is honest. They can want things without shame, a good meal, a warm body next to them, work that means something, a Saturday with nothing to do. They laugh from the belly. They weep without apologizing. They've stopped trying to be above their own life and started living all the way down inside it. But here's the difference, and it's everything. They do all of this while remaining whole. The anger doesn't consume them. The desire doesn't own them. They've integrated the shadow they met in the blackness, so their darkness no longer runs the show from underground. It sits at the table with everything else, acknowledged, allowed, no longer dangerous because no longer denied. And they've kept the clarity they earned in the whitening, so even in the middle of strong feeling, there's a steady center watching, present, unafraid. Jung called the deep aim of all of this individuation, the lifelong process of becoming the specific, complete person you actually are, rather than the assembled performance you learn to be. And the rubedo is individuation reaching its fullness. Not a saint who has escaped their humanity, a human being who has finally stopped being at war with it. This is the union the alchemists were obsessed with, what they called the coniunctio, the marriage. In their pictures, it was often shown as a king and queen coming together, sun and moon, red and white joined into one. Jung read this as the wedding of opposites inside a single psyche, the conscious mind and the unconscious, the spiritual and the animal, the part of you that reaches upward and the part of you that's rooted in mud and blood and hunger. For most of a life, these are split, fighting, exhausting each other. In the rubedo, they stop being enemies and become one thing. You can feel the size of what that means if you sit with it for a moment. Almost all human suffering runs along the fault lines between these opposites. The war between what you want and what you think you should want. Between the person you show the world and the person underneath. Between your longing for meaning and your longing for pleasure, as though you had to choose. The reddening is what happens when that civil war finally ends. Not because one side won, but because you stopped needing them to be at war at all. If you've been walking your own version of this road, through the falling apart, through the long, cold clarity that came after, and some part of you senses there's a further country you haven't reached yet, a warmth you can't quite find your way back into, then our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this stretch of the path. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's work, made to help you carry what you learned in the dark and the light back down into an ordinary, embodied, fully lived day. It's linked right below. And now let's keep going, because the most important question about the reddening is the one almost nobody asks. why so few people ever reach it?
The reason the Rubedo is rare has nothing to do with intelligence or even effort.
It's about the specific fear that guards the door to it. Because to come back down into full color, you have to give up something that the whitening gave you, and it's something the psyche clings to with everything it has. You have to give up the safety of distance. The cool clarity of the white stage protects you. When you float slightly above your own life, nothing can hit you too hard. You watch your emotions like weather instead of being soaked by the rain. You understand your relationships instead of being wrecked by them. And that protection is intoxicating, especially for someone who reached it by surviving the blackness. Someone who was flattened once and swore they'd never let themselves be that vulnerable again. The reddening asks you to walk back into vulnerability on purpose, to care again, fully, knowing what caring costs, to want things you might not get, to love people you will eventually lose, to let the warmth back into a body that learned, in the cold, how much safer it felt to stay numb. This is why so many people who have done deep inner work stall out in a permanent, elegant detachment. It isn't that they failed, it's that the final step asks for a courage the earlier steps didn't, the courage to be soft again after you finally got hard enough to survive. Jung understood this pull towards safe distance from the inside. He had lived his own blackening, a period where he felt his mind coming apart, where he confronted the unconscious directly and wasn't sure he'd come back sane. He knew the temptation to armor himself in pure analysis, to live in the intellect where it was clean and controllable. And he knew that the deeper work required him to keep coming back down into ordinary life, into his family, his relationships, his patience, the small, warm texture of daily existence, and to stay there, present, embodied, rather than escaping upward into abstraction. So he was suspicious of any spirituality that only pointed up, any teaching that treated the body as a problem, desire as an enemy, ordinary life as something to transcend. He saw those paths leading straight into the frozen white and calling it enlightenment. The genuine article, he insisted, always came back to earth. The truest sign of someone who had done the deepest work wasn't how far above life they floated. It was how fully they had returned to it. Picture two people who have both spent a decade in serious inner work. The first has become smooth, unruffled, wise-sounding, a little untouchable. You sense that nothing reaches them anymore, and part of you envies that, and part of you notices you can't quite feel them there in the room with you. The second is messier. They still get frustrated in traffic. They still ache when their kid ignores them. They still want, still reach, still stumble. But when you're with them, you're fully with them. There's a warmth, a groundedness, a sense that they're all the way inside their life instead of hovering at the edge of it. Jung would tell you the second person has traveled further. The reddening is written all over them. This is the great inversion at the heart of Jung's reading of alchemy, and it upends nearly everything our culture assumes about the spiritual path. We think the goal is to need less, feel less, want less, to sand ourselves down into something serene and untouchable. Jung found that the actual goal is to become capable of feeling everything without being destroyed by it, to have a wide open heart and an unshakable center at the same time. The reddening isn't the extinguishing of the fire, it's the point where you finally become able to hold the fire without burning down. And the fire itself changes character in this final stage, which is the part that moves me most about the whole image. In the blackening, fire is a destroyer. It burns your old identity to ash, and it feels like annihilation. That same fire, in the reddening, becomes a hearth. The heat that once tore your life apart is now the warmth that makes a life livable. Nothing about the flame changed. What changed is your relationship to it. You went from being consumed by your own intensity to being warmed by it, from being at the mercy of your depths to being at home in them.
There's an old alchemical phrase Jung loved to return to, a line describing the goal of the whole work, the union of the spiritual and the material. Heaven and earth married inside a single vessel. For centuries, people read that as a formula for making literal gold. Jung read it as the description of a human being who has stopped splitting themselves in two, who no longer has to choose between depth and aliveness, between meaning and pleasure, between the sacred and the ordinary, because in them,
these have become the same thing. The gold the alchemists were chasing was never in the flask. It was the person they became by staring into it for so long. So what does the reddening give you, really, once you've paid the price of coming back down? Jung was careful never to promise it as a state of permanent bliss, because it isn't one. The person who reaches the Rubedo still lives an ordinary human life, with all its ordinary difficulties. They still lose people. They still face fear. Nothing exempts them from the conditions of being alive. That's the whole point. They've stopped looking for an exemption. What changes is their relationship to the whole of it. There's a groundedness that circumstances can't shake, because it isn't built on circumstances. Somewhere in the fire, they stopped needing life to be a certain way in order to be at peace with being alive. They can hold joy and sorrow in the same hand without needing to resolve them into a tidy story. They've lost the desperate need for everything to mean something reassuring, and in losing it, they've found that everything means more, not less. The bloodless white clarity that once felt like the destination turns out to have been the doorway to something far warmer. They also come into a strange new relationship with time. The person still reaching for the next stage is always leaning forward, always slightly absent from the present because the present isn't finished yet. The person who has come through the reddening has largely stopped leaning. There's nowhere further to get to, no better version of themselves waiting around the corner, because they've finally arrived inside the only self they were ever going to be. And that arrival lets them actually live in the day they're in instead of the one they're chasing. The ordinary moment stops being a means to somewhere else and becomes the entire point. I think this is what draws people to be near someone who has genuinely reached this place, even when they can't name what they're sensing. There's a fullness of presence to them. They're not performing wisdom, not managing your impression of them, not floating somewhere above the conversation. They're just there, completely, warmly, with color in their face and blood in their hands, an ordinary person who has become entirely themselves. And being near that has a way of reminding you that the same thing is possible for you, because it is. That's what Jung staked his life's work on. The reddening isn't reserved for mystics or geniuses or people with unusual gifts. It's the natural end of a process available to any human being willing to go all the way through it, through the blackening where the old self dies, through the whitening where clarity returns, and then the hardest step of all, the step most people skip, back down, on purpose, into the warm and vulnerable and gloriously ordinary business of being alive. If you're somewhere on this road right now, let me tell you what I think matters most about where you are. If you're still in the black, still in the dissolving, the falling apart, the stretch where you can't recognize your own life, then know that the ash is not the end of the story. It's the first stage of a sequence, and every alchemist who ever lived would tell you that the blackness is where gold begins, not where hope goes to die. And if you've already come through that, if you've reached the cool clarity and the quiet mind, and you've been living in that silver light for a while now, content, insightful, a little remote, a little pale, then this is the part I most want you to hear. That clarity is real, and you earned it. But it isn't the finish line. There's a warmth waiting past it that you may have talked yourself out of, because the last time you let yourself feel that fully, it nearly destroyed you. The reddening is the invitation to come back down and let the color return, to care again, to want again, to be moved again, but this time with a center steady enough to hold it all. The fire that once burned your life to the ground is the same fire that's meant to warm it. You've already survived the worst of what it can do. What's left is to let it do the other thing, the thing it was always heading toward, and bring you all the way home into a life that finally feels like yours, lived at full temperature, with nothing in you left out in the cold. The alchemists spent their whole lives chasing gold and never understood that they were the gold, forming slowly in the heat of their own attention. Jung spent his life helping people see the same thing about themselves, that the point was never to escape being human. The point was to become so completely human that the ordinary and the sacred stopped being two different things. that a plain Tuesday and the deepest meaning you've ever touched could be the same moment, held in the same hand, lit by the same steady fire. That's the reddening. That's the gold at the end of the long work. Not a rising away from your life, but a homecoming into it, so total that you finally stop looking for the door out and realize you were always meant to live all the way in. If you feel that warmth calling you back down, if you've done the hard work of falling apart and finding clarity, and you're ready now to let the color return to your life, our guide True Self-Discovery is made for exactly this crossing. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's own map of becoming whole, built to help you carry everything you've learned in the dark and the light back down into an embodied, fully lived, ordinary day. Follow the link below and let this be the beginning of your own reddening.